السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. مرحبا بكم جميعا ومرحبا بمتحدثينا. I'm going to speak in English until our friend here gets his earpiece. Today we have four speakers, mashallah. It's a good session. And the theme today is mostly about settler colonialism. The order of the speakers is first Dr. Maikel Fishbach, who is professor of history at Randolph-Macon College in U.S. state of Virginia. He's author of records, book Records of Dispossession, Palestinian Refugees, Property and Arab-Israeli Conflict, Columbia University 2003, and Jewish Property Claims Against the Arab Countries, Columbia University 2008, which examine property losses sustained by Palestinian Arabs and Jews from Arab countries in the wake of the 1948. And also the Israeli war, and he is more recently studied U.S. politics, activist, understandings of Arab-Israeli conflict during the 1960s. This research led him to publication of Black Power and Palestine, Transnational Countries of Color, Stanford University 2018. The Movement and the Middle East, How Arab-Israeli Conflict Divided American Left. Each speaker, I must add that Dr. Fishbach is a very influential Jordanian guy. His daughter is a very senior person in the Jordan government. Let us aim to 12 to 15 minutes. I'll firmly stop you with time. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Sabah al-khair. Let me first say something in Arabic. على الرغم من أني أتكلم اللغة العربية فإني أفضل اليوم أن أتحدث معكم عن هذا الموضوع في اللغة الإنجليزية ويوجد ملخص في العربي في الكتيب لديكم. In May of 1976, less than 2 months before many Americans were set to celebrate 200 years of independence from Britain, American Indian activist Jimmy Durham made the case in New York City that both the native peoples of America and Palestine had suffered similar fate at the hands of foreign invaders who had robbed them of their independence and their land. He said, quote, "The American Indian people were put into reservations that are like the Palestinian refugee camps." Speaking at the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, Durham, who was of Wolf Clan Cherokee Indian descent, was active in a group called the American Indian Movement. Continuing with his comparison between Indians in America and Palestinians, Durham said, quote, "We fight the racism that says we are savage people, that we are terrorists because we fight for the rights of our people. We stand with the Palestinian people and the Palestine Liberation Organization." These words indicate that Indian activists in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s were not merely aligning themselves with the Palestinian struggle, but they saw themselves directly facing a comparable situation and waging a similar struggle to regain their land and their rights from foreign invaders. Nor were American Indians indigenous peoples alone in this. So were some Latinx, that is to say Latino and Latina organizations, such as the Puerto Rican group, the Young Lords Party. In 1971, the Young Lords issued a policy statement that said, quote, "The Europeans and the Yankees are like one big city and the third world is the countryside. They must fight genocidal wars in the countryside as well as fight against their own internal enemies. The first front is Indochina. The second front is Palestine." In other words, like Indians, Latinx peoples felt that they were native peoples whose land had been occupied and stolen by foreign colonists An affinity with the Palestinians therefore came easily to them. The point of my paper is that amidst the global uprising against colonialism and other forms of imperialism in the 1960s and 1970s, Native activists within the United States began seeing themselves and the Palestinians as kindred peoples who had been forcibly deprived of their land, their independence, and had their presence erased by foreign settlers, and who now were resisting such colonization. Indian and Latinx groups like the American Indian Movement, the Young Lords Party, the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional Puertorriqueña, and the La Raza Unida Party not only waged an anti-colonial struggle at home in the United States and Puerto Rico, but extended support for the Palestinians overseas as well. Their actions during that tumultuous period of history set the stage for decades of Native activism on behalf of Palestine. My paper details the support given by Indian and Latinx activists to the Palestinians starting in the 1960s. It pays particular attention to how Native activists in North America understood that they shared a common history of dispossession and a common vernacular of liberation with the Palestinian resistance organizations. It also, my paper that is, also details how support by Native activists in the United States has continued until today. And it concludes that the discourse on Palestinian society among Native activists in the United States has changed over the decades, from that of a shared revolutionary nationalist struggle, as was expressed in the 1960s and 70s, to today a shared victimization by settler colonialism and securitized border structures that govern the movement of people and criminalize them. Throughout my paper and my comments this morning will highlight prominently the actual words used by Native activists in the United States to give you a sense of how they understand their common fate with the Palestinians. Looking first at Indian people, and I use the word Indian instead of Native American because many Indian activists refuse the term Native American and prefer the term Indian. There were, in the midst of the revolutionary upheaval in the 1970s, groups such as the American Indian Movement began dramatizing the erasure and the genocide to which Native indigenous peoples in America had been subjected at the hands of European colonists over a period of 400 years. Having been defeated in battle, driven off their lands, confined to areas far removed from their original land, they saw a shared factor in their history with that of the Palestinians. As the Dakota activist Wazayatawatin explained Indian solidarity with Palestine, she said, quote, "Of course, the Zionist ideology that underpins Israeli colonial occupation is the same as the manifest destiny ideology that underpinned US colonial expansion, in that both are based on a belief in a divinely sanctioned right to occupy someone else's land." And the figure Russell Means, a leader in the American Indian movement, said, quote, "Like the PLO, we are vitally interested in regaining our country and our sovereignty." In the late 1960s and 1970s, Latinx activists similarly extended support to the Palestinians as part of a shared nationalist struggle. It came naturally to them. The indigenous Taino people of Puerto Rico had been colonized first by Spanish colonists and later faced colonization by the United States after it seized Puerto Rico in 1898. The Young Lords Party was an expression of Puerto Rican nationalism in the US in the late 1960s. Its 13-point political platform stated that no Puerto Rican is free until all people are free. And the party's Minister of Information, Juan Gonzalez, gave a speech in 1971 in which he spoke of Israel's war with the Palestinians as really being America's proxy war. Another group known as the FALN similarly saw its Puerto Rican struggle as comparable and part of a world struggle shared by the Palestinians. In September 1982, the FALN detonated a bomb in New York City. It claimed that the bombing was in outraged reaction to the Sabra Shatila massacre in Lebanon. And the group hailed the, quote, heroic resistance of the Palestinian resistance. Nor was Latinx opposition to Israel restricted merely to Puerto Ricans. The Chicano, that is to say Mexican-American organization, the La Raza Unida Party, throughout the United States similarly expressed strong support for the Palestinians in the 1970s. In 1979, the California branch of the party issued a statement that, quote, the La Raza Unida Party supports the belief that the Palestinian people have the right to a homeland and self-determination. And indeed, representatives of that party traveled to Beirut in 1975 and 1980 to visit the PLO and meet with Yasser Arafat himself. But by the 21st century, in our times, Native groups, both Indian and Latinx, have continued to express support for the Palestinians, but have shifted their theoretical focus away from national liberation exclusively to a more sophisticated understanding of a shared struggle on the basis of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism in the past 2 decades has emerged as a critical focal point of studies of the Zionist experience in Palestine, as well as of settler colonial regimes in North America and elsewhere. As critical theorist Teodora Todorova has said, quote, this scholarship has been at pains to highlight the structural nature of Israel's colonization of Palestinian land, and in turn to emphasize the settler aspect as the defining mode of displacement of the indigenous Palestinian population. So it's no surprise that in recent years, we see Native activists in the United States embrace the concept of settler colonialism as a way of expressing their shared struggle with that of the Palestinians. By way of example, in May of 2011, just 12 years ago, Melanie Yazzie, who's a Diné or Navajo Indian activist, visited Israel and the West Bank. She said later, after returning to the southwestern United States, I went there because I wanted to understand colonization in other parts of the world, not just the United States, so it could inform my work against colonization and colonialism here on behalf of Navajo people, because this is my homeland. These are my people. I love this place and I want to protect it. Melanie Yazzie saw that the Palestinians also suffered deeply from the same kind of settler colonialism that had decimated indigenous nations in the United States for over 400 years. She wrote, quote, I now see the living death to which Palestinian and Native peoples are consigned by contemporary settler societies as an essential function of these societies. Going on, she said, quote, Palestinian liberation requires the liberation of indigenous and other oppressed peoples from occupation from Israel's collaborator and guarantor, the United States. Effective organizing and mobilization occurs when seemingly unrelated issues like the occupation of Palestine are linked to local concerns such as ours. She and other pro-Palestinian Diné Indians sought to, in her words, challenge the interlocking, transnational, and hyper-militarized form of settler colonialism that dominate both the U.S. and Israeli nationalism. Because the United States and Israel are so intimately intertwined, Native liberation is bound to Palestinian liberation. Indeed, 1 month after Yazzie's own trip to Palestine, the scholar I referenced a moment ago, Wazi Yatawin, also visited the West Bank in 2011 as part of a delegation called Indigenous Women of Color Feminists. Her experience led her as well to many of the same conclusions about the similarity of Indian and Palestinian experiences with settler colonialism and the tactic of erasure from the landscape. She said, quote, erasure is another tactic used by colonizing powers, and it takes a variety of forms. I witnessed the attempted erasure of Palestinian people and presence on the land in multiple ways. All such colonial efforts, she said, are designed to assert a claim to land while simultaneously attempting to make the indigenous into the foreigner. Similar tactics characterize colonial claiming and renaming of indigenous spaces in the US, she said, accompanying the theft of our land and the implementation of major campaigns of ethnic cleansing, there was always a process of ideological colonization. Other Indian activists began visiting Palestine, and Palestinians, including the Palestinian youth movement, began visiting Indian lands in the southwestern part of the United States, seeing the extent that a shared commitment to decolonization characterized both peoples as participating in a common global structure of resistance. Israel's July 2014 attack on Gaza spurred a new wave of Indian solidarity, including the formation of a Facebook site called the American Indian Palestinian Solidarity Network. Melanie Yazzie, for her part, in 2014 formed a group called Dineh for Sanctions Against Israel. For her, again, the commonality of the Palestinian and Indian experiences were deeply analogous. She wrote, "Our desire is simply to live free from colonial violence. Nor was it simply Indians in the past 20 years who have expressed solidarity with the Palestinian struggle on the ideological basis of mutual struggle against settler colonialism. So too have Latinx communities as well. A 12-member People of Color delegation also toured the West Bank in 2008. They returned and spoke of how they had seen Israeli border guards and soldiers demanding to see Palestinian identification documents, and it reminded them exactly of how American border guards demand identification from Latinx persons in California near the border with Mexico. The wall that the delegation saw in the West Bank similarly reminded activists such as Peter Camacho, who returned to the United States and worked on a presentation entitled "Two Walls, One Struggle," a structural comparison of colonization, territorial loss, and racist aggression in Mexico and Palestine. The similarity, he noted, between Latinx persons in the United States and Palestinians in the West Bank, facing militarized border walls, documents deciding who is legal and who is not legal, was very, very familiar with him. I might add in conclusion that Native peoples in the United States embracing of the dialogue and the discourse of settler colonialism as the basis of their shared struggle with Palestinians in the Middle East has in very recent years spread beyond simply Indian and Latinx natives in the United States. In 2018, a group of Americans of Asian, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian persons themselves issued a statement in support of the BDS movement, in which they said, quote, "As peoples of the Americas whose ancestors come from Asia, Hawaii, and the Pacific, and as members of indigenous communities in these regions, we issue this statement of solidarity with the people of Palestine in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Israel, and in the diaspora. Our statement is based on our own historical experiences of imperialism, settler colonialism, racism, militarism, war, economic and land exploitation, displacement, incarceration, and forced migration. It emerges from our relationships with the Palestinian people and our solidarity with their historical and current-day freedom." To conclude then, within the United States, starting in the late 1960s, but continuing until this very hour, Native activists, notably Indians, Latinx people, and most recently those of Asian and Pacific descent, have embraced the Palestinian cause. Initially, they saw it in the 60s and 70s as part of a shared nationalist struggle, but more recently have come to understand it, as many around the world, as a shared struggle against settler colonialism. The commonality of these struggles has animated and continues to engender solidarity activities on both sides of the world. As the Indian activist Yazi Yatawatan noted, quote, "As a Dakota woman in Palestine, I had the painful experience of witnessing the monstrous destruction of settler colonialism's war against a people and a land base." The growth of anti-democratic forces in the world today has pointed out the fragility of liberal constitutional democracies such as those as Israel and the United States. The resistance among Native peoples continues to take various forms, and it is for this reason that Latinx activists in the United States long have said, "La lucha continua," the struggle continues. Or as Native activist Milo Yellowhair said, "The spirit of Chief Crazy Horse is alive, and the spirit of resistance still travels this land." Thank you very much. Shukran jazilan.
Shukran, thank you, Dr. Fischbach. I always wondered why President Obama, when he decided to kill Osama bin Laden, codenamed the Operation Geronimo. And I thought that maybe a secret sympathizer for bin Laden had coded this word to portray him like the resistant Indian man. المتحدث القادم هو الأستاذ عبد الله موسوس، وهو طالب دكتوراه في معهد الدراسات العربية والإسلامية في جامعة إكستر، وبحثه يتناول العلاقة بين الرأسمالية العالمية والممارسات الاستعمارية الاستيطانية ومنطقها، وكان قد استكشف في أعماله الأكاديمية السابقة سياسات الطعام مع إشارة خاصة إلى شاي الكرك which is very nice.
شكرا.
والدور الاجتماعي والسياسي لميمات الإنترنت في جنوب آسيا وغربها، وهو أيضا يمارس الكتابة الإبداعية في مجال القص التأملي. موضوع الدكتور هو حالة المشاريع أو الدكتور المرتقب، حالة المشاريع الاستعمارية المترابطة في فلسطين وكشمير، فهم الاقتصاد الاستعماري الاستيطاني العالمي في القرن ال21.
شكرا كثير. شكرا للكل.
لو حد يجيب دكتور ترانسليتر عبدو. He hasn't got translation. اوكي طيب.
شكرا كثير. على كل الأحوال رح أقدم أنا في الإنجليزي كمان. كتبت أنا الورقة في اللغة الإنجليزية، وأنا مش كثير شاطر بالترجمة المباشرة والترجمة السريعة، خاصة بعد سفر طويل، فاسمحوا لي. بس قبل ما أبلش، الباوربوينت موجود، ممكن أنا أحط البرزنتيشن تبعي على الشاشة، أو إذا صعب مش مشكلة بقدر أنا أقدم بدون
أنت start بعدين.
أوكي تمام، مش مشكلة. I will start without it. As I said, thank you very much to everyone for being here. It's an honor for me to be able to present this paper titled The Case of Interconnected Colonial Projects in Palestine and Kashmir, Understanding the Settler Colonial World Economy in the 21st Century. Rather bizarrely, I'm going to start my presentation in neither Palestine nor Kashmir, but rather in South Africa, where in 1985, the then apartheid President P.W. Botha addressed the National Party Congress in Port Elizabeth. If we can go to the next slide. This picture is actually taken in Durban in the same year, but I thought it illustrated very well what I'm trying to talk about. The South African politician and anti-apartheid activist Ronnie Kasrils in 2013 compared the then Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's quote saber-rattling intransigence to that of P.W. Botha and his extremists, referring to the speech he gave in 1985 in Port Elizabeth, predicting that Israel would, quote, seek alliances with reactionary feudal forces and aid and abet regional and international confrontation in the years to come. Significantly, this comparison between Botha in the later days of South African apartheid and Netanyahu in more recent history uncovers two different answers to questions about the extent and the nature of post-Cold War world capitalism and settler colonialism's dependency upon one another. In the case of the anti-apartheid movement, Dale McKinley describes late 1985 as being a key turning point in response to the political and economic situation inside the country, lurching from one crisis to the next, if I quote him. Famously, or rather infamously, in what was later termed the Rubicon speech, P.W. Botha declared or proclaimed that he was, quote, not prepared to lead white South Africans and other minority groups on a road to abdication and suicide, and that if one were to destroy white South Africa and our influence, this country would drift into faction strife, chaos, and poverty. So of course, I'm not buying into the notion here that the major players of South Africa's private sector were anti-racists by any stretch, but Botha miscalculated the support that he would receive from them. And so later on, a delegation of South African businessmen from all the big corporations, Barloran, Anglo-American Premier Group, visited ANC leaders in Lusaka to discuss the potential terms of dismantling the regime. And famously, there was an Anglo-American corporation executive, Zach De Beer, who and the way he put it was, we dare not allow the baby of free enterprise to be thrown out with the bathwater of apartheid, tacitly implying that the business of capital accumulation under a free market could continue under kind of like a post-apartheid regime in South Africa. And so this series of events demonstrates that capitalist elites and their institutions, both locally and globally, do play an important role in sustaining the networks of settler colonialism and apartheid. So with that being said, the study's objective. So while Kashmir has experienced a de jure decolonization during the later years of and after the Cold War, Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid have only expanded. And at the same time, India's control over Kashmir tightened during the same period. Like many other states in Asia and Africa, both Israel and India had begun projects of neoliberal economic transformation around the start of the period in question that we're talking about, in response to crises that contributed to and were affected by the decline of the Cold War multipolar configuration of global power. So therefore, the aim of the study then is to understand the relationship between settler colonial logics and the world economy that emerged from these transformations, using the case study of the interconnection between the Israeli colonial project in Palestine and the Indian colonial project in Kashmir. And so I emphasize at this point that this is not a comparison between them. This is a study of the interconnection and what it reveals to us about the questions that I'm trying to address. So just to be clear, I have the maps up here of Palestine and Kashmir. Of course, I think, are very familiar with the map on the right. The map on the left, not as much. The former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir was split in 1947 due to a series of events between the three states of Pakistan, India, and China. The green part representing Pakistan, being kind of held at the moment by Pakistan. The orange part, or rather the yellowish part, occupied by India, and the red part by China. And then within that, Kashmir within the Indian-held parts, we can further break it down into three regions. Ladakh, which is kind of the area on the right. There's a big mountain range passing through the middle, as you can see. That's the main Himalaya range. The region to its east is Ladakh, and the region to its west is Jammu and Kashmir. You see a smaller mountain range just under the symbol for the airport. Over there, that's the Pir Panjal range. And so the valley between those two ranges is the Kashmir Valley. So to kind of the northeast of the Pir Panjal range is the Kashmir Valley, and to the southwest of it is the Jammu region, which experienced its own kind of situation of ethnic cleansing in 1947 as well, with the genocide of Muslims that were there. So with that being said, and kind of the regions introduced, I want to talk a little bit about why I'm using an interlinking approach rather than an analogous one. And for this, I cite Robin Kelly, who argues in an article on Black Palestinian transnational solidarity that those approaches, the analogical or comparative ones, can, quote, sometimes lead to historical distortion and muddled political intentions. Rather, solidarities, he argues, should be framed in terms of world-making that take into account, quote, the eruption of post-1947 history, 1967 history into the present struggle. So on the opposite side of a similar assertion, it's necessary to look at the world being created by the relationship between the Indian and Israeli colonial states, rather than simply looking at it as a strategic partnership or as a component of wider geopolitical coalitions and conditions, as a lot of studies that address these cases do. Of course, that's not a weakness of those studies, but rather, in my view, just something that I think requires further addressing and further analysis. So there are a lot of areas in which the connected cases of the colonizations of Palestine and Kashmir can be analyzed with respect to how they fit into these kind of wider global configurations. So there's the ideological aspect, the narrative aspect, ecological mechanisms as well that play into it. But this study focuses on the core economic movements that animate this connection in the context of the world economy. So by analyzing sources detailing these movements, I look at defense, financial and logistical ties mainly, and how those render both states' colonial practices and ambitions in Palestine and Kashmir key components of the current phase of world capitalism and neoliberal integration. So the argument is that there's a mutualism between the world economy and logics of settler colonialism, so whose movement across the current phase of world capital, whose movement across the world shapes practices of securitization and dispossession that drive racialized neoliberal integration and capital accumulation globally. So just to go over the theoretical background, there are three kind of core concepts that I'm working with. How am I doing on time, if I can ask?
6 minutes.
6 minutes. I'm not gonna go very deep into the theory in that case, but just to kind of address them very quickly. Racial capitalism is largely useful here because, of course, as Cedric Robinson says, race, quote, with each historical moment is kind of the epistemology of, the epistemology of, quote, the rationale and cultural mechanisms of domination, as well as its ordering principle, its organizing structure, its moral authority, its economy of justice, commerce, and power. And in this case, we're talking about Palestinians and Kashmiris, both of whom are racialized in the context of these colonial experiences. The settler colonial ethos is one that I want to kind of talk a little bit more about, because I think that this is the one that maybe is a little bit less discussed. So I'm using here particularly the work of Ghassan Haj, who breaks down this notion of the settler colonial ethos into three ideas, three features that kind of move across space and time into the world. The first is that there is this notion of always being geared towards war, and so this goes back to kind of the notion of securitization talked about by theorists like Andy Clarno. The second one is the place and function of extremism in the political field. And the third of these is the relative inability to distinguish between the domains of war and peace. So by here, he refers to how the kind of settler populations, or those who kind of are configured as the settler population, if not necessarily like ontologically the settler population, cannot be kind of like kept away from the violence of continuing with the settler colonial ethos. And so this is kind of like the kind of, I suppose, essence of settler colonialism rather than its practice in kind of like a strictly practical sense. To talk a little bit about the relationship between India and Israel, and here I've used this like rather bizarre meme. This, if any of you are on Twitter, this is a really common theme that you'll see now under a lot of tweets that come from supporters, well, from like Israeli government figures, from Israeli government accounts, and kind of very active and vocal pro-Israel figures. There will often be a tweet, and then under it there will be a lot of what I think are bots or paid individuals who strongly kind of emphasize the affinity between India today and Israel. I included this one here because it's a little comical, because, of course, as you notice, the Indian flag is not in Netanyahu's tweet. And so rather than being upset or angry with him, the respondent here keeps referring to him as sir, and essentially kind of like really wants the Indian flag to be included there. So more practically, speaking in economic terms, Andy Clarno referred to Israel as a racial Fordist economy prior to its economic liberalization in the late 80s. And India also kind of had a similar sort of, India kind of followed an economic policy known as Swadeshi, which refers to kind of like economic nationalism and economic self-determination, where the kind of homegrown goods were prioritized over exported ones, and then a lot of policies were taken to kind of like promote the kind of purchasing of locally produced goods and items at the expense of kind of importing things and other things like that. 2 minutes. Oh, okay. Then we move. In the late 80s, of course, Israel and India liberalized, as I said, and there were some key components that I'm going to address in this presentation very quickly, since I only have a couple of minutes. The first of these is the arms trade. Post-1992, Israel and India started purchasing arms from one another, and this is very linked to India's position in Kashmir, because of course in the early 90s or in the late 80s, an armed insurrection broke out against Indian rule, and Israeli expertise was sought to confront that. This is a really bizarre video that was produced by the Israeli arms company Rafael in 2009. I don't recommend anyone watches it unless they want to torture themselves, but you can. And so as we see here, India became the top destination for Israeli arms from the 90s onwards. And this has moved now rather from just purchasing towards manufacturing Israeli arms in India. So for example, the Adani Group got a big contract relatively recently to manufacture Israeli drones in India. And the Adani Group, of course, has its connections and kind of like has come to prominence due to its relationship with the BJP government and Narendra Modi. There are also these financialized connections. As we can see, this statement was issued in the middle of last year, and it largely focuses on kind of exchange between the private sectors, but some analysts and commentators like Azad Isa have talked about how this also is part of a security configuration and kind of the way the US is now thinking about security in the region by kind of outsourcing to these other states over there. And in his terms, renders India part of the political economy of Israeli occupation, and therefore also the other way. There are other examples I'll go into. I could go into, but I won't due to time issues. And then finally, I think just before I end, I'll talk about the Haifa port, recently licensed to Gautam Adani. Again, the Adani Group coming up in this conversation. And of course, this is relevant because, of course, ports and networks of logistics essentially are, as Laleh Khalili would put it, not simply the enabling adjunct of trade, but central to the fabric of global capitalism. Again, as I said, this links back to Kashmir because the Adani Group and their involvement also is linked with the production of the arms that are used over there, also as part of securing kind of that colonial project. So, just to conclude, these are the points by which I wish to conclude that these kind of defense, financial, and logistical ties embed kind of the colonizing of Palestine and Kashmir deep into world capitalism, particularly in the late 20th century and in the 21st century as well. And so by no means, I should also say that this is an exceptional situation. I've only looked at one relationship here and how it demonstrates these points. But given Castril's prediction in 2013 that Israel would move closer towards autocratic regimes, which has come to pass in light of circumstances that have arisen in the last few years, political economies of settler colonial alliances will also develop elsewhere. And on that point, I will end.
شكرا جزيلا أستاذ عبد الله. Just to make a test, everybody here understands English ولا في ناس إلا بالعربي؟ أوكي. طيب على كل إن أنا برضو هعمل التقديم بالعربي لصالح إذا كان في حدا. الأستاذ أسانغا اللي هو هيقدم الآن presentation بعنوان شراكة معقدة المسار المتمامي للعلاقات الأسيرية الأفريقية، وهو طالب دكتوراه بجامعة شرق البحر المتوسط في فاماغوستا في شمال قبرص، واهتماماته البحثية تشمل الحوكمة ودراسات التنمية وحل النزاعات والسياسة الخارجية وأفريقيا في العلاقات الدولية. لديه منشورات في مجلات محكمة ومدونات أكاديمية وأوراق مقدمة في مؤتمرات دولية. يعمل أيضا مراجعا في مجلتين محكمتين، كما أنه زميل باحث في المعهد الدولي للحوكمة IGI في الكاميرون، وعضو في الرابطة الدولية لطلاب العلوم السياسية. 15 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for that introduction, although I did not understand what you said, but I believe it's okay. So my paper is entitled Complicated Partnership, the Evolving Trajectory of Israeli-African Relations, and just some brief highlights on what the paper focuses on. It looks at the evolving relationship between Israel and Africa from 1950 to 2022, and the Palestinian response to that relationship. It uses realism as its theoretical framework, and the major findings of this paper are that Israel's bilateral relations with African states were mostly cordial. Meanwhile, the multilateral, I'm not going to use a PowerPoint for time's sake, but just please bear with me. But its multilateral relations with African continental bodies were mostly hostile. Secondly, African states tended to prioritize their national interests, which pushed them to severe or resume ties with Israel based on what was in their best interest at the time. The research question for this paper, there are two. The first one is what has been the nature of Israeli-African relations from independence till date? And the second one is what has been the Palestinian response towards Israel's relations with Africa from independence till date? And I have two hypotheses equally. First, Israeli-African relations are bilaterally cordial and multilaterally hostile. That's multilaterally refers to the continental bodies. Secondly, national interest supersedes continental priorities in shaping the response of African countries towards the advances of Israel in Africa. This paper has the following structure. The first part looks at the theoretical framework, which I said is based on classical realism. The second part delves into the evolution of Israeli-African relations within three major eras. We have the decolonization era, we have the OAU era, we have the AU era, and we also look at Palestinian relations to Israeli-African relations in the aforementioned eras. Thirdly, we have a section devoted to policy recommendations towards building a proactive Palestinian diplomacy towards Africa. Concerning the theoretical framework, as I said, this particular paper is based on classical realism, and it focuses on the reality of international politics by emphasizing the constraints on politics that results from humankind's egoistic nature. The choice of classical realism as the theoretical framework is based on the fact that this particular paper deals with state actors and national interests, which is best analyzed from classical realist assumptions. The paper focuses on how domestic factors shape state foreign policy. And in this case, we look at the foreign policy of Israel and the Palestinian reaction towards it. So as I said, Israel's relations with Africa had three major eras. We had the era of the Organization for African Unity, the era of the African Union, and we're going to look at, the decolonization era, the OAU era, and the AU era. So I'm going to start directly with the decolonization era, which stretched from the 1950s to the 1960s. Now, it's important to point out that the 1960s saw the rapid gaining of independence of a number of African states. And Israel, as a country that was suffering from diplomatic isolation, saw this as an opportunity to create diplomatic links with newly independent African states. So in this particular case, from the classical realism prism, Israel was motivated by its national interest, which was to get diplomatic recognition. And in the case of the newly independent African states, they were looking at technological and agricultural assistance that they could get from Israel. So it was a kind of win-win partnership between the two. And Israel was able to create 33 embassies in sub-Saharan African states, offering them foreign aid. And the torchbearer of this rapprochement between African states and Israel was Golda Meir. I hope I pronounced it well. So we have that era that continued right up to 1960, and we had a very good cordial relationship between, which was mostly bilateral. Now, what was the Palestinian reaction? At this particular period in history, it's important to point out that we had the formation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1964, and they were more focused on entrenching their position since they needed that recognition. So there was very little as concerns Palestinian relations with Africa. I moved to the era of the Organization of African Unity. That's from 1963 to 2002. So we had the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, that was established on the 25th of May, 1963. That offered Africa the opportunity for the first time to speak in one voice in international fora. So this particular situation changed the dimension of Israeli-African relation that moved from exclusively bilateral to simultaneously bilateral and multilateral, because Israel had to now relate with a continental body that came, which was the African Organization of African Unity. And this particular period, I distinguish it in two phases. The first phase is diplomatic honeymoon. That's between 1963 to 1967, when we had the Six-Day War, what is known in Arabic as Naksa. There was some kind of clear cordiality between Israel and the OAU. And then we had diplomatic dissonance from 1967 to the demise of the OAU in 2002. So briefly, I could explain these two phases. In the first phase, there was a lot of cooperation between Israel and African states. Israel was offering them agricultural training. It was offering them technological assistance, and created a lot of embassies. But during the Naksa, Israel occupied Sinai Peninsula, and the African OAU saw it as an invasion of Africa. So they came into solidarity with Egypt to contest Israel. And the last straw that broke the camel's back was in 1973, when we had the Yom Kippur War, which many African states cut links with Israel. They severed diplomatic ties with Israel because the OAU practically compared Israel to the apartheid regime in South Africa, and said and condemned their oppression against the Palestinians. So that ended the era of the OAU, and we moved to the era of the African Union. It's important to note that the OAU ended in 2002 and was replaced by the African Union. And one of the persons that was instrumental in the establishment of the African Union was the former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. And Gaddafi used his position to influence Israel not to receive an observer status. The observer status that Israel had under the OAU, it lost it at the advent of the AU. And because of that, Israel's main focus within the AU period was to try to regain that observer status. So we had a strong focus on rebuilding that tarnished relationship between Israel and Africa. And the main person that was championing this cause was Benjamin Netanyahu. In what we call the Netanyahu decade, that's from 2009 to 2021, he had a lot of diplomatic offensive in Africa, trying to renew ties that was cut off during the previous period. And that led up to 2021 when the chair of the African Union decided to attribute Israel an observer status, which created a serious controversy within the African Union because you had Algeria and the rest that were against this granting of observer status. And the issue was not resolved because an extraordinary African Union summit that held in 2022 decided to create a committee to look into how the issue can be amicably resolved and pushed the issue to 2023. So this year we're going to look at what will happen, but what's of interest again is the Palestinian Authority reaction towards this particular relationship. Now, it's important to point out that during the AU era, the Palestinian Authority expanded its especially, let's say, the OAU and the AU era, the Palestinian Authority had some engagement with Africa, opening embassies in different African states. But what was particularly lacking was that its diplomatic engagement lacked content and orientation. So it's true they had presence, but there was nothing like what is the focus of the Palestinian foreign policy. So they were not really very much active on the ground. So I'm going to end with some policy recommendations on how to build a proactive Palestinian diplomacy towards Africa. The first is that the Palestinian Authority needs to identify, define, and clearly articulate an African foreign policy. So it's not enough to have diplomatic presence, but it's important to use that presence as a means to project the Palestinian cause and to win other African states towards the Palestinian cause, because right now I believe that the Palestinian Authority is contented having friends like South Africa and Algeria without trying to break new grounds, which will enable them to get more African countries. Secondly, the Palestinian diplomacy has to become proactive rather than reactive. Much of Palestinian diplomacy is a reaction to what Israel is doing in Africa. But it's important for them to pose their own actions and try to pursue something without looking at, reacting to what is happening with Israel. Thirdly, the Palestinian Authority also needs to conceive partnerships and cooperations because given the realist logic, states tend to opt for mutually beneficial cooperation, which is win-win. So, it's important that when you're engaging in states with diplomacy with states, you should offer something on the table. So it's important for a win-win partnership. Fourthly, which I believe englobes the other 3 points that I've pointed out, is the Palestinian Authority needs to create what I'll call Palestinian institutes, which can, in all its diplomatic representations on the continent. Now, these Palestinian institutes can serve as a platform for the Palestinian Authority to showcase its culture, its history, because in Africa, a lot of people hear so much about Israel and they get the mainstream narrative, but few are able to hear the Palestinian side of the story. So that lack of, an objective assessment make people to usually tend to favor the Israeli narrative. So these Palestinian institutes can really help to, to close that gap. So with that, I think I'll call it the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asanga, for keeping to the time. Last but not least, منى عبد الله وهي محررة وباحثة في مشروع بحث القضية الفلسطينية وتوثيقها ومرشحة الدكتوراه في الجامعة الأردنية. نشرت عدد من الأوراق في مجلات محكمة، منها اللغة والتأويل عند البراغماتيين الجدد، رورتي نموذجا، وثنائية الأنا والآخر في أدب سارتر، مسرحية الأولى المغلقة نموذجا، وبراغماتية المعرفة الحكائية في بنية الحكاية الشعبية الفلسطينية، قصة الشاطر محمد نموذجا، وأخيرا فصل في كتاب أشكال وأساليب مقاومة التطبيع مع الكيان الصهيوني في الأردن دراسة ميدانية في كتاب استراتيجية المقاطعة ضد الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ونظام الأبارتهايد الوغ والطموح عن المركز العربي. تفضلي.
شكرا دكتور، شكرا ويعطيكم العافية. ورقتي اليوم بعنوان إشكالية الديمقراطية في الكيانات الاستعمارية وفق نظرية العدالة عند جون رولز الكيان الصهيوني، راح يكون نموذجنا التطبيقي. في البداية راح نحكي إنه منطلق هذه الورقة سيكون من صورة النظام الديمقراطي المؤسسة على معايير التعاون المنصف في بنية المجتمع الأساسية، ثم في مؤسساته السياسية والاجتماعية كما حددها جون رولز في نظريته، ونطبقها على الكيان الصهيوني في فلسطين في ضوء تقريرين حقوقيين مختارين، هما تقرير نظام الفصل العنصري الإسرائيلي ضد الفلسطينيين الصادر عن منظمة العفو الدولية في عام 2022، وتقرير تجاوز الحد السلطات الإسرائيلية وجريمتا الفصل العنصري والاضطهاد الصادر عن منظمة Human Rights Watch عام 2021. ومع مقاربة هذه النتائج التي أتى بها التقريران بمؤشر الديمقراطية الإسرائيلي لعام 2021 ومؤشر الديمقراطية العالمي ل 2021 كذلك. بداية لا يسعفنا الوقت ربما للحديث عن كل ما تطرقت إليه نظرية جون رولز في العدالة، لكن نقول باختصار بأن هذه النظرية تدمج بين المساواة الاجتماعية والاقتصادية، وتطور مفهوم الديمقراطية الذي بات يعني وفق هذه النظرية العدالة السياسية التي تنطلق من فكرة أن المواطنين أحرار ومتساوون وقادرون على وضع الشروط المنظمة للتعاون المنصف في مجتمعاتهم. هذه النظرية تقدم لنا مجموعة من المعايير نستطيع أن نسترشد من خلالها حالة تقييمية، أو نستطيع أن نقيم من خلالها المجتمعات أو الحالة الديمقراطية في المجتمعات بصورة عامة. ويمكن حصر هذه المعايير في 3 محاور رئيسية. عندنا المحور الأول هو النظام السياسي الديمقراطي، والمحور الثاني المجتمع الديمقراطي، وأخيراً المسألة الاقتصادية. وفق نظرية رولز النظام السياسي الديمقراطي له ملامح، وأهم هذه الملامح أنه يضمن للأفراد حقوق المشاركة السياسية ويتعامل معهم على أنهم أحرار ومتساوون، وأن يحقق النظام السياسي القائم مبدأ الديمقراطية التداولية. أما المجتمع الديمقراطي فأهم ملامحه هي أن كل فرد فيه يعامل بالاحترام نفسه الذي يعامل به الآخرون بغض النظر عن خلفيتهم الثقافية أو العرقية أو الدينية. وأيضاً أن أساس المساواة يكمن في امتلاك الأفراد نفسهم يمتلكون الإحساس بالعدالة. أخيراً المسألة الاقتصادية تحدث عنها رولز في نظريته تحت عنوان ديمقراطية امتلاك الملكية، وهو لا يتحدث فقط عن توزيع عادل للثروة بين الأفراد، وإنما شكل هذا التوزيع يكون منطلقه النظرة إلى الفرد على أنه أو جميع الأفراد على أنهم متساوون، واحترام الفرد، كل شخص، كل مكون، كل إنسان احترامه بذاته واعتباره قادر على إدارة شؤون. إذا كنا نتحدث عن نظرية تتناول العدالة والديمقراطية ونتحدث عن الاستعمار في المقابل، لابد من الحديث عن العلاقة بين الاستعمار والديمقراطية، وهي بالضرورة علاقة سلبية. تتنافى طبيعة الاستعمار مع قيم الديمقراطية والعدالة كما يقدمها رولز في نظريته. النظرية تقول مثلا أن المجتمع الديمقراطي تنسجم فيه الجوانب الاجتماعية والاقتصادية والأخلاقية والنفسية مع مفهوم العدالة بجانبه السياسي، وهذا الجانب السياسي يشمل الحقوق والحريات الأساسية المحققة للمواطنة، بما في ذلك حرية التفكير والضمير والحريات السياسية وحق إنشاء الجمعيات والكرامة الجسدية والنفسية للأفراد، والحقوق والحريات التي يحددها القانون حتى خارج الإطار السياسي، وأيضا حرية الحركة والتنقل والأسس الاجتماعية لاحترام الذات وتكافؤ الفرص بين جميع الأفراد، وخاصة في تولي المناصب التي لها أثر في صنع القرار في المجتمع وفي النظام السياسي. إذا كنا نتحدث هنا عن كيان استعماري علاقته بالديمقراطية يجب أن نضع أيدينا على محل التناقض. قلنا هذا ما تقدمه لنا نظرية رولز في مسألة شكل المجتمع الديمقراطي، لكن في المقابل الاستعمار أهم سمة يتسم بها أي استعمار، سواء كان استعمار بصورته الأولى أو استعمار استيطاني، هي سمة العنصرية أو التمييز العنصري. فالعنصرية وترافقها مظاهر تفرقة ولا مساواة تؤسس عليها علاقته مع الشعب المستعمر، وبالتالي هذه المفارقة بطبيعة الحال تنفي وجود أي علاقة إيجابية تربط بين الاستعمار والديمقراطية. يعني بالضرورة الاستعمار يتنافى مع كل قيم الديمقراطية والعدالة. وإذا كنا نريد أن نتحدث عن الكيان الصهيوني بشكل خاص، فربما نضيف إلى ذلك أن الاستعمار بصورته العامة يأتي كمستعمر يحاول، أو يعني هو يأتي ومعه العنصرية، وحتى إذا قرر أن يتعايش مع الشعب المستعمر فإنه يتعايش معه تعايشا عنصريا وتمييزيا. لكن الكيان الصهيوني ينتهج أو يرفع شعار المحو العنصري، هو لا يريد أن يكون الفلسطينيون موجودون، يرفض ذلك يعني بشكل موجودين بشكل مطلق، وحتى من تبقى منهم في أرضهم فهو حريص على مقاطعتهم أو الانعزال عنهم. الآن إذا كانت هذه هي شكل، أو هذا هو شكل العلاقة بين الاستعمار والديمقراطية، ما الذي تقوله إسرائيل في خطابها الديمقراطي الذي تقدمه للعالم وتقدمه للعرب، وحتى تروج له في كسبب من أسباب الصراع العربي الإسرائيلي والصراع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي؟ إسرائيل تصف نفسها بأنها دولة يهودية ديمقراطية، وهذا طبعا يرد في وثيقة الاستقلال ويرد في قوانين الأساس التي ستؤسس عليها دستورها الذي لم يتأسس حتى الآن طبعا ولم يكتب، وأنها تقول أنها لا تفرق بين رعاياها، لا من منطلق الدين ولا العرق ولا من منطلق الجنس، وأنها تقيم دولة على أساس المساواة التامة في المواطنة بين جميع الأفراد. هذا الخطاب الإسرائيلي وهذا ما تقوله إسرائيل، لكنها حريصة أن تقدم نفسها دولة يهودية ديمقراطية. وهنا يعني يكمن التناقض الداخلي فيما تقوله إسرائيل عن نفسها، وهذا ما نستطيع حتى أن نؤشر عليه بصورة واضحة في ضوء نظرية جون رولز. ما هي شكل الديمقراطية التي تتحدث عنها إسرائيل؟ هذا هو السؤال المشروع إذا كنا نريد أن نتحدث عن نظام استعماري أو نظام هو وليد لاستيطان استعماري، أو دولة وليدة أو ناتجة عن استيطان استعماري وتقدم نفسها بأنها دولة ديمقراطية. ما هو شكل هذه الديمقراطية التي تتحدث عنها إسرائيل؟ طيب، طبعا وجه التعارض واضح كما قلنا في الأساس بين الأنظمة الاستعمارية وقيم الديمقراطية بسبب العنصر الأساسي، وهي مسألة العنصرية والتمييز العنصري الذي يأتي به الاستعمار للشعوب المستعمرة. لكن إذا حددنا أكثر فيما يتعلق بنظرية رولز، نرى بأنه هذا فكرة الدولة اليهودية الديمقراطية، فكرة الدولة اليهودية الإثنية الديمقراطية الإثنية، تتعارض مع فكرة التعددية المعقولة التي يطرحها رولز في نظريته، إذ يتسم المجتمع الديمقراطي بحسب رولز بالتعددية التي تجعله في مأمن من النزاعات العقائدية والطبقية الاجتماعية، وتحقق له الاستقرار المطلوب في ظل العدالة والثقافة الديمقراطية الحرة، ويتنافى مع أحد أبرز ملامح المجتمع الديمقراطي التي أشرنا إليها سابقا، وهي حفظ حق الأفراد بأن يعاملوا بالاحترام نفسه على قدم المساواة بينهم بصرف النظر عن أصولهم العرقية أو خلفياتهم الثقافية والدينية. الآن، وهذا يعني أنا كنت أتحدث في عجالة حتى نصل إلى هذه النقطة، نريد أن نتحدث عن إسرائيل في مؤشر الديمقراطية الإسرائيلي. بشكل سنوي يتضمن 6 محاور رئيسة. المحور الأول اللي هو الوضع العام في إسرائيل، والمحور الثاني الديمقراطية والحكومة والمواطنون، والانتخابات ثالثاً الانتخابات والإصلاحات الحكومية، رابعاً الثقة بمؤسسات الدولة، خامساً المجتمع الإسرائيلي، وسادساً النظام القانوني. هذه المحاور الستة تندرج تحتها مجموعة من الأسئلة. اخترنا منها في هذه الورقة 5 أسئلة نريد أن نرى أو نطلع على نتائج المؤشر الإسرائيلي فيها. والسؤال الأول هو: كيف تصف الوضع العام لإسرائيل اليوم؟ المؤشر يشمل عينات من العرب واليهود، والنتائج هنا كما يظهر في الشكل أو في الرسم البياني يظهر التفاوت الواضح في بين آراء اليهود والعرب. إذا ركزنا مثلا على وصف إسرائيل بأنها الوضع في إسرائيل بأنه سيء وسيء جدا، نلاحظ أن آراء العرب التي تؤكد أو تقول بذلك هي ضعف ما يقوله اليهود في دولة إسرائيل. هذه النتيجة أيضاً إذا قارناها بنتائج السنوات السابقة في المؤشر الديمقراطية الإسرائيلي تشير إلى تزايد استياء مختلف مكونات المجتمع الإسرائيلي حتى اليهود من بينهم من الوضع العام في إسرائيل إذا ما قورنت بنتائج آخر 4 أعوام في مؤشر الديمقراطية. السؤال الثاني هو: توصف إسرائيل، وهذا في صلب المسألة التي نتناولها اليوم، توصف إسرائيل بأنها دولة يهودية وديمقراطية في الوقت نفسه. هل هناك توازن بين الأمرين؟ طبيعة الإجابة على هذا السؤال ستكون إما أن ما يراه المستجيب أنها الطابع الديني يغلب على الدولة، أو أن الطابع الديمقراطي يغلب عليها، أو أن هناك توازن بين الأمرين. النتائج كما توضح الرسوم البيانية، هذا جزء من الرسوم البيانية، هذا فقط الجزء المتعلق بآراء اليهود على اختلاف تياراتهم بين اليسار والمعتدلين واليمينيين عفوا. لكن بصورة عامة النتائج حتى إذا قارناها مع نتائج آراء العرب في إسرائيل، يظهر أولاً التباين الكبير بين آراء العرب واليهود حول يهودية الدولة مقابل ديمقراطيتها. يكاد يصل هذا الاختلاف وهذا التباين إلى حد التناقض إذا قورنت آراء العرب مع اليمين اليهودي تحديداً. ولا يخفى هنا أن ذهاب أغلب اليمينيين إلى القول بغلبة بغلبة وصف الديمقراطية على الدولة ليس لأنهم يلاحظون ملامح ديمقراطية، وإنما لأنهم يرغبون بدولة أكثر يمينية وأكثر يهودية وأكثر دينية. كيف نقرأ هذه النتيجة بهذه الصورة؟ لأنه إذا قرأنا نتائج آراء اليهود أنفسهم نلاحظ التباين. اليسار يرى أنها دولة ليست ديمقراطية وإنما دولة يهودية بامتياز. وطبعا بقية النتائج يعني أنا مضطرة إلى حتى نطلع على الأسئلة البقية ونطلع على آخر محاور الورقة. السؤال الثالث كان يتناول إلى أي مدى يتم التمسك بالمبادئ الآتية في إسرائيل اليوم: حقوق الأقليات والحق في العيش بكرامة وحرية التعبير والفصل بين السلطات. إذا قارنا نتائج آراء العرب في المجتمع الإسرائيلي أو في الدولة مع آراء اليهود هناك، سنلاحظ كيفية نظرة اليهود أنفسهم إلى أنفسهم في الدولة ونظرة العرب إلى أنفسهم في هذه الدولة. اليهودي عندما يستجيب على هذا السؤال يتعامل معها وكأنه مواطن يبحث عن مزيد من الامتيازات الاجتماعية والسياسية، لكن العربي يهتم بمسألة مثلا حقوق الأقليات، هذه كانت أقل اهتماما عند الجانب اليهودي من مكون المجتمع، إما بعدم الاستجابة أو بقول لا أعرف أو بقولهم بأنه ليست مشكلة كبيرة. رابعاً، هذه أيضاً يجب أن يتمتع اليهود في إسرائيل بحقوق أكثر من المواطنين في غير اليهود. هذا السؤال أيضاً يعكس توجه المجتمع الإسرائيلي إلى مزيد من العنصرية والتمييز الذي تؤسس له الدولة أصلاً. فإذا لاحظنا النتائج من عام 2015 إلى عام 2021 هي في تزايد مضطرد نحو تأييد هذه المقولة. هاي النتائج لليهود. فآرائهم بتزايد مضطرد. من عام 2015 كانت النسبة 25%، ثم الآن في عام 2021 57% من اليهود يرون بأنه نعم من حق اليهود أن يحصلوا على حقوق أكثر من غير اليهود في المجتمع الإسرائيلي. النظام الديمقراطي أخيراً في إسرائيل في خطر. أيضاً تشير النتائج إلى تفاوت كبير بين آراء العرب واليهود، تشير إلى تقارب بين آراء اليهود بين التيارات الوسط واليمين واليسار حتى في عام 2021 بالقول بانحدار. طبعا اليمينيين يقولون بارتفاع نسبة الديمقراطية. قبل أن أختم دكتور بعد إذنك، أريد أن نلقي نظرة على المؤشر إسرائيل في المؤشر الديمقراطية العالمي. إسرائيل في مؤشر الديمقراطية العالمي حصلت على نسبة 76% عام 2021. منها كان 34 من 40 نقطة للحقوق السياسية، وحصلت على 42 من أصل 60 نقطة للحقوق المدنية. والغريب في مؤشر الديمقراطية العالمي عندما يتحدث في التقرير الخاص بإسرائيل أنه يتحدث بشكل صريح هنا عن أن القيادة السياسية في إسرائيل تمارس تمييزاً واضحاً بين اليهود وغير اليهود في الدولة الإسرائيلية، لكنهم مع ذلك قرر القائمون على المؤشر استبعاد كل ما يتعلق بالأوضاع في الضفة الغربية وفي غزة، من باب أن هذه المناطق لها تقارير خاصة تصدر فيها وتتعلق فيها. آخر محور في الدراسة لن أتحدث عنه بالتفصيل، اللي هو الفكرة اللي هو هذا المحور اللي بيهمنا فيما يتعلق بالتقارير، تقارير منظمة العفو الدولية ومنظمة هيومن رايتس ووتش. موجود في الورقة بالتفصيل ما تضمنته هذه التقارير من مظاهر تنفي الديمقراطية عن إسرائيل كنظام سياسي وكمجتمع. لكن أريد أن أعرج على بعض النقاط هنا. أبدأ من سادساً آخر شيء دكتور في آخر شيء. أبدأ من سادساً اللي هو يتعلق في التقارير. يعمد نظام الحكم الإسرائيلي إلى مأسسة اللامساواة في الدولة على جميع الأصعدة السياسية والاجتماعية والاقتصادية، وثمة شواهد على ذلك تؤكدها الممارسات الإسرائيلية على الأرض. هذا الكلام موجود بشواهد مفصلة في التقريرين وفق ما يرد في تقارير المنظمات الدولية. وسابعاً لا تحقق إسرائيل أي من مبادئ العدالة المؤسسة للديمقراطية على الصعيد السياسي كما يقدمها رولز في نظريته العدالة كإنصاف، إذ تنطلق من قاعدة يهودية الدولة التي تحد من المشاركة السياسية لكل من يرفض هذه القاعدة أو يعترض عليها، وهي بذلك لا تحقق شرط توفير الحريات السياسية لجميع المواطنين ولا شرط التداولية في الحكم باستبعاد جزء من المواطنين من مواقع صنع القرار تحت مظلة القاعدة نفسها، كما أنها تحرم الفلسطينيين من حق الاعتراض على القوانين المتعارضة مع مصالحهم، بل وتمارس ضدهم سياسة الترهيب والاعتقال، ما يعني أنها عمليا تستثنيهم. نحن لا نتحدث عن الفلسطينيين في الضفة الغربية فقط هنا، هي تمارس سياسة الاعتقال السياسي في الفلسطينيين موجودين في الأراضي المحتلة عام 1948 أيضا في ظل الانتخابات الإسرائيلية وغيرها. ثامناً، لا يحقق المجتمع الإسرائيلي شروط المجتمع الديمقراطي التي تقررها نظرية العدالة عند رولز، إذ يحرم الفلسطينيون من حق التجمع وإنشاء الجمعيات وحرية التعبير عن الرأي، ويعطل الاحتلال حقهم في حرية الحركة والتنقل بفرضه إجراءات أمنية مشددة تحد من تنقلاتهم، تمنعهم من الوصول إلى العديد من المناطق وتجبرهم على العبور من خلال الحواجز للوصول إلى ممتلكاتهم وأماكن عملهم أو تحصيل بعض الخدمات الأساسية منها الصحة والتعليم. وكذلك تتنافى سياسات الاحتلال ضد الفلسطينيين مع شرط تحقيق الكرامة الجسدية والنفسية، وهذا يعني مرئي بشكل يومي، يعني حتى اليوم على الحواجز الفلسطينية، على الحواجز الإسرائيلية في الضفة الغربية، وحتى يعني بين المناطق المجزأة والمفصلة في فلسطين. تاسعاً، وأخيراً لا تحقق إسرائيل معايير العدالة الاقتصادية في المجتمع الديمقراطي، إذ تغيب مبدأ تكافؤ الفرص والتوزيع العادل لرأس المال بحرمانها الفلسطينيين من مصادر دخلهم والتضييق عليهم اقتصادياً من خلال مصادرة الممتلكات والأراضي وعدم منحهم تصاريح للبناء، بل وهدم منازلهم ونقلهم قسرياً من أراضيهم وممتلكاتهم، وعدم الاعتراف بعشرات القرى والبلدات والتجمعات الفلسطينية، وكذلك بمنعها الفلسطينيين من تحقيق التنمية العادلة من خلال إخضاعهم لسياساتها وقيودها الجبرية، ويشمل ذلك الفلسطينيين في الضفة الغربية والقدس الشرقية وقطاع غزة، والفلسطينيين حتى الحاصلين على الجنسية الإسرائيلية، إذ تطبق عليهم سياسات تمييزية أدت إلى وضعهم ضمن مستويات اقتصادية متدنية مقارنة بالمواطنين اليهود. أختم بقولي أن خلاص ما أختم؟ أوكي طيب يعطيك العافية.
طيب شكرا جزيلا. شكرا جزيلا. We have about 20 minutes for question and answer. تفضل if you can ask in English it will be better. لكن ممكن بالعربي.
أستاذي جميعها موجودة في الورقة، فمتى ما نشرت أو بعرفش إيش الطريقة اللي ممكن تحصلوها فيها، لكن كل المصادر موجودة. فريدم أذكرها فقط. فريدم هاوس لمؤشر الديمقراطية العالمي، ومؤشر الديمقراطية الإسرائيلي، مؤشر الديمقراطية الإسرائيلي موجود على فريدم هاوس جهة أمريكية، إسرائيل الحكومة.
أوكي تفضل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم. الباحث علي حشاني من الجزائر. شكرا للجميع على هذا الإثراء الفكري المعرفي. لدي 3 أسئلة. السؤال الأول موجه للدكتور مايكل. هل ترى فشل ترامب في الانتخابات الرئاسية لعهدة ثانية كان من بين أسبابه هو تضامن جزء من السكان الأصليين اللاتينيين للولايات المتحدة لأمريكا؟ السؤال الثاني للباحث نونغ. كقراءة مستقبلية، هل ترى أن التغلغل الإسرائيلي في إفريقيا سيبلغ مراحل متقدمة في ظل غياب قوة إفريقية مؤثرة اقتصاديا وماليا؟ وهل سيؤثر التواجد الصيني على تراجع هذا التغلغل؟ أما فيما يخص الأستاذة منى، أرى أنه مبادئ الديانة اليهودية لا تتوافق أبدا مع الديمقراطية. نحن نعلم أنه بعض معتقدات الديانة اليهودية مثلا لا يعترف بيهودية أي شخص إلا إذا كانت أمه يهودية، فهذا لا يحقق مساواة. إلى أي مدى ترين أن الديمقراطية ستتحقق في إسرائيل؟ وهل ستكون الديمقراطية عائقا لبناء دولة؟ وشكرا.
يعطيكم العافية جميعا. أنا سؤالي للزميلة منى، يعني عرضت الورقة أو عبرت عن البون الواسع بين النظرية والتطبيق في العرف الإسرائيلي. يعني هناك تناقض بين ما تفعله إسرائيل في آلتها العسكرية، يعني هي نموذج أقول أنه الاستعماري الإحلالي الاستيطاني الذي لا يشابه أي نموذج استعماري في العالم أجمع. يعني لم يسبق أن مر على العالم كله نموذج استعماري كإسرائيل، يعني التي قامت يعني الأسبوع الماضي بمجزرة في جنين، وهي تقدم نفسها اليوم في خطابها على أنها دولة ديمقراطية وتحاول إقناع، وهي يعني بالرقم 76 في مؤشر الديمقراطية العالمي، وهذا أمر مثير ومريب جدا في الحقيقة. سؤالي منى الآن، إسرائيل هل فعلا بكل هذه الآلة العسكرية والتي نراها كل يوم أمام أعيننا، هل تعنى فعلا بتجميل صورتها وتقديم نفسها أمام العالم على أنها دولة ديمقراطية؟ وأمام من؟ يعني أمام القانون العالمي، أمام الشرعية الدولية، أمام الدول العربية، والخطاب الموازي الفلسطيني العربي، هل يستطيع ربما مجابهة هذا الخطاب؟
شكرا، يعطيكم العافية. اسمي حسن أيوب. بدي أبدأ بس بملاحظة صغيرة للدكتورة منى تتحملنا. اختيار المؤشرات الديمقراطية وبالتحديد مؤشر الديمقراطية العالمي اللي معروف تماما عن فريدم هاوس إنه مؤشر الديمقراطية عندهم معيوب من الناحية الميثودولوجية ومنحاز، ومعروف تماما إنه الشخص اللي وقف وراء هذا المؤشر دانيال بايبس عنده انحيازاته الأيديولوجية الصهيونية المكشوفة، ولذلك أنا أنصح ب يعني قراءة مختلفة لهذا المؤشر. والمؤشر الآخر بتصدر الحكومة الإسرائيلية ذاتها، وبالتالي يعني أنا بقترح إنه عليك يعاد قراءته ويعاد قراءة الموضوع كمان في ضوء التطورات الأخيرة، في ضوء تشكيل الحكومة الإسرائيلية الجديدة. شكرا لك على my first question is to Michael, if I may call you so. Your presentation sort of, I don't want to use the word excluded, but it did not touch based on the question of African Americans and the solidarity between African American movements since the late 60s up until today, ending with Black Lives Matter. Would you illustrate more why it is not part of your presentation, since the question of colonialism is not only about the natives, it's also about oppressed people in the United States. So if you may just respond to that. My second question is to Abdullah. It is very clear that neoliberalism and economy is very much related to colonialism. But there is another aspect that you may want to shed light on, which is the cultural part of the question. By that I mean India in the late 30 years maybe, it was drifting towards some kind of Indo-nationalism that exclude the Sikh and the Muslims. So the state itself was subject of deep shift in its identity. Does that have anything to do with the increasing ties between India and Israel, and how does that affect the question of Kashmir and the Palestinian question? Thank you so much.
Anis Darami from the Institute of Palestine in South Africa. I've been working in the policy of Palestine in South Africa for about 15 years. And I believe your recommendation is quite sharp and quite to the point. And I also convey the message that it has been understood, I think, from the Palestinian Authority that this is what they should do. But I don't understand why they can't do that. What's the difficulty of not achieving a Palestinian policy toward Africa, a comprehensive one? That's my question.
Thank you. So السؤال الأول straight forward للأستاذة منى. اللي بحكي إبراهيم. منى في ظل كل اللي ذكرتيه من مؤشرات والآخر، وأتفق معك تماما. إلى أين الأمور ذاهبة خاصة بعد مايو 2021؟ قراءتك من هناك كقراءة مستقبلية في ظل التطورات على الأرض اليوم، وين إحنا رايحين؟ The second question for Fon. You mentioned all the shifts in the African politics, and you know it's very depressing, annoying, and frustrating to see all the actually lack of engagement of the Palestinian diplomacy. However, what are the rules of African activists, freedom activists, in kind of influencing the politics, and what their rules actually in establishing and launching student societies at the different mainstream universities, as well as to engage in a grassroots level through NGOs and as well as through the local organization, in order to not to copy, to say, to duplicate the offers have been done by many activists in the United States and in Europe. Thank you.
To Mr. Nog, I'm wondering if you have witnessed any differences between the reaction of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority before Oslo and after Oslo toward the Israeli-African relationship. And my second question is really directed to Muna. I'll be asking it in Arabic. تحدثت في السؤال الأول في المؤشر الإسرائيلي حول الديمقراطية عن رأي العرب واليهود حول الحالة العامة، وانت عرضتي وان جراف أو يعني شكل واحد، فانت دمجتي الإجابات مع بعض. فما بعرف إذا في بس بعض التفصيل حول الفروق ما بين يعني رأي العرب وكذلك رأي اليهود. شكرا جزيلا.
السلام عليكم، يعطيكم العافية جميعا. ياسر صنوبر من جامعة قطر. لا يوجد لدي سؤال وإنما تعليق بسيط بخصوص كلمة الاستعمار. لا نستخدم كلمة الاستعمار في أي شيء يتعلق في فلسطين. هو احتلال مجموعة من الإرهابيين الفارين من أوروبا، لا يطلق عليهم سوى احتلال فقط أو مغتصبين. شكرا.
Okay, I'm going to add a question for both Michael and Abdullah. Okay, you can go.
شكرا. دكتور شادلي من جامعة قطر. السؤال موجه للأستاذة منى. أعتقد أن هناك خطأ منهجي في طرح القضية، لأن نستعمل نظرية جون راولس للعدالة لقياس معيار الديمقراطية والمساواة على كيان مؤسس من حركة استعلائية، حركة صهيونية، وبالتالي الحركة مثل ما قال الدكتور إرهابية أيضا. هذا لا يستقيم. نموذج جون راولس للعدالة هو يطبق على الدول الأصلية، الدول التي تؤسس بطريقة طبيعية وليست نتيجة لحركة استعلائية الصهيونية، لأن الحركات الاستعلائية بطبعها لا تتوافق مع أي فكرة من أفكار العدالة. وشكرا.
The point I would like to ask you both about is that in the comparison of the Indian Americans and the Latinx in America, not appropriate for the settler colonialism in Israel, for the reason that there is a specificity to the Israeli project. Maybe there is a parallel in the way the settler Americans tried to exterminate the native people, but I think the early settler Americans were probably prepared to live with the Indians. They do not have an inherent project for eliminating them if they could be domesticated, or and the same, of course, even more to the Latin American. And the fact that the Israeli project, for example, now for the Indians and for the Latinos, at least at the moment, the project of extermination has ended a while ago. It's not being pursued at the moment. And there is now a movement to get some more of their rights and pushing for them. And it's the same for the Black Americans. They are pushing for their rights, and they have been improvement in their rights in the last 30 or 40 years. But the Zionist project is still continuing in inflicting what the settler Americans were doing in the 17th century and the 18th century, and what the slavery were doing in the. So you have to first put a stop to what they are doing. But there's also the issue of the religious justification, and that also relates to the other point, that the economy is not a consideration for the Israelis at the moment. First of all, because as an ideological project similar to the Nazi project of the extermination of the Jews, the issue is not any, as Hannah Arendt has said, doesn't make any economic sense to eliminate the Palestinians instead of helping them to improve the economy and using them actually to highlight, to boost the. And of course, Israel is doing this because it's being subsidized mostly through what I would call ibtizaz or blackmail, yes, economic blackmail for Germany and for America through its lobbies to get lots of funds, more funds. So The project itself is profitable in this sense in our side, so they don't need to have to look at the Palestinians. So this is my point. I think there is a specificity to the Israeli project which make it unsuitable for any comparison.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to, should I take all the three questions at once?
Yes,
or?
yes,
Okay.
but 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
All right. The first question, I think he was talking about the difficulty in achieving a comprehensive Palestinian foreign policy in Africa. I think it's a matter of political will concerning, with reference to the Palestinian Authority. I think that is not their major priority for now. Their major priority seems to be domestic and concentrating on their major partners. So they have a kind of selective diplomacy. So I feel that in forums like these, platforms to raise that awareness, probably some way, somehow they may pick on it and things may change. Secondly, what are the roles? I think somebody asked about the roles of African freedom movements and student societies, NGOs, in changing the narrative concerning the Palestinian-Israeli issue. If I'm not mistaken, that's the question, right? Okay. Well, I feel also that this also has to do with the kind of perception and information that they have about Palestine. You can't act on what you don't know. So I remember one of my academic mentors made a statement to me that it is not sufficient to be right. It's important to be seen as right. So as much as the Palestinians are right, if they are not perceived as right, it's difficult for people to embrace their cause. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in promoting that perception and changing the narrative, more so because we have a mainstream media that is biased, in the favor of Israel from, the United States, Europe, and the rest. So that gives a lot of responsibility on Palestinians to embrace, sharing their stories and telling their own side of the story. So I think with that, I think NGOs and the rest can pick up on that and be more active. But in South Africa, we have a strong civil society support for Israel, but I think that can also extend in other countries. Lastly, I think that somebody talked about the difference between the PLO and the Palestinian Authority concerning Israeli-African relations before the OAU. The PLO was practically not involved, not engaged. The Palestinian Authority has been engaged but limited, the content is very, very, shall I say, small or very lacking. So I feel right now the onus is more on the Palestinian Authority to put. We have more than 40 African countries that recognize Palestine. And there are a lot of Palestinian embassies in several African countries, but much of the work has to do with giving that representation some level of content and policy orientation. And I feel that it's also part of the responsibility of academics like us to raise this awareness to the Palestinian government.
Very quickly, one of the questions was why I didn't address Black Americans. About 4 years ago, I wrote an entire book on this called Black Power in Palestine, which was looking at the Black connections with the Palestinians or with Israel, actually, in the 1960s and 70s. So this was an attempt to discuss some other peoples besides African American. Well, to be truthful, I wanted to include a section on indigenous people and Latinx in that book, and Stanford University Press thought that was getting off the subject, so that's why I talked about it here. There was a question by a doctor about the differences between Zionism in Palestine and Manifest Destiny in the United States. Regardless of my own interpretations, my paper was trying to offer the voices of Indian activists themselves, and a number of them do see a strong comparison there, even on religious bases. So I was trying to express what many of these activists themselves see in terms of that similarity. Lastly,
what do you think?
I think there are a great deal of parallels. I do think the religious and the economic, and I also think one of the huge differences, though, is the fact that disease eliminated so many of the indigenous peoples in America that the colonists didn't have to worry as much about how do we get rid of these people because they died because of disease. Very quickly, أخيرا إذا فهمت السؤال عن إذا الكلمتين استعمار واحتلال أنه آية واحدة منهما مناسبة بالنسبة إلي، بعتقد أنه الكلمتين سوا مناسبتان. احتلال استعمار أو استعمار استيطاني في فرق ما بين الكلمتين، بس بالنسبة إلي الوضع بفلسطين وكلا بفلسطين وبأمريكا الشمالية استخدام الكلمتين مناسبة. هذا بالنسبة إلي.
صحيح، الاحتلال قد يكون دائما مفهومه مؤقت بينما الاستعمار بروجكت مستمر. تفضل.
شكرا دكتور. To address the first question on the cultural aspect, so I understood this question two ways actually. So to kind of address the second part first, which is about the shift in identity against Muslims and Sikhs over the last few decades, I think those aspects were actually there before as well, but there was this kind of like public discourse of secularism that kind of covered it. But the Congress Party's internal politics, since even before independence, have always been very confessional. And particularly had awkwardly positioned Muslims and Sikhs, and also lower caste and non-caste individuals in India, kind of against the kind of more dominant powers that were at the time and continue to be. And I think kind of the movement, kind of the development then of kind of like the Hindutva movement in India and the kind of the century-long project that it had enacted, has kind of led to that becoming much more clear and obvious. And then there is, of course, the cultural aspect in the other way that I interpreted it between Israel and India, that actually a lot of the consent building is done through culture. So, for example, I had the misfortune of watching a really horrible but very popular Bollywood film recently called Mission Majnu, which was meant to be about the Indian espionage into the Pakistan nuclear program back in the 70s. And Israel comes up very frequently in this film as being kind of like, well, the Israelis' data is always correct. Israel are really going to deal with the Pakistani nuclear problem. And that is just one example. I don't recommend that you watch the film, by the way. It is also really horrible and probably will. Yes, I'm recommending things not to watch because I will do that labor for everybody of exposing myself to it. And so this is, yes, exactly part of my work as a Palestinian Fida'i. Anyhow, to address the second question from Dr. Abdul-Wahab, in my understanding, and I think this is also shown in a lot of really interesting works, for example, by the work of Nadia Al-Hajj, the economy is more of a tool to achieve the project rather than a key consideration. I agree, it's not the key consideration, but there are ways, and that's actually the argument that I'm trying to make, is that there are ways in which the economy is used to kind of further this kind of ordering of power that powerful agencies, entities, and actors want to achieve. And at the same time, it feeds off of the logics of settler colonialism and at the same time feeds into it. And so that's kind of the argument I was trying to make. I agree that the economic considerations at kind of like an objective value, if such a concept could exist, that there are objectivities in economic thought, are not the key consideration. And then on the topic of whether comparison is appropriate or not, I get asked this a lot because a lot of people don't like to compare Palestine and Kashmir. A lot of Kashmiri scholars have done some really, really good comparative studies of Palestine and Kashmir. But I think the idea is not to find two cases that are the same, but rather to look for points of similarity that then we can theorize from as kind of a methodological point. And in this sense, I think the Kashmiri scholars' work comparatively across Palestine and Kashmir has contributed in very helpful ways to thinking about then how can that be confronted at a local and global level. Thank you.
I think the Israelis rightly think that the Holocaust is incomparable So if you compare the Holocaust, for example, with something else, I think also the Zionist occupation is not incomparable. It's more like the Holocaust.
أبدأ بالسؤال الأول. السؤال الأول اللي هو إلى أي مدى قد تكون الديمقراطية قد تساعد الديمقراطية في تحقيق أو بناء الدولة الإسرائيلية، أو قد تكون عائق لبناء هذه الدولة. بالإشارة إلى علاقة الديمقراطية بالديانة اليهودية التي أشار إليها صاحب السؤال، من باب الطرافة إنه على موقع وزارة الخارجية الإسرائيلية، وهي تعرف نفسها بأنها دولة يهودية ديمقراطية، تقول المقالة المنشورة على الموقع بأن أحد مصادر الديمقراطية هي الديانة اليهودية. يعني هذا ما تروج له حتى إسرائيل. إلى أي مدى تعريف إسرائيل نفسها بأنها دولة يهودية ديمقراطية في الوقت نفسه ديمقراطية إثنية غير متحققة حتى في إسرائيل يحمل تناقض بنيوي لا يخدم إسرائيل أبدا، ويجعلها موضع استهداف دائم، لأنها تروج لديمقراطية مؤدلجة، والديمقراطية المؤدلجة بطبيعة الحال تتعارض مع الديمقراطية بالمفهوم الليبرالي يعني المعتمد والمعروف. في السؤال هل إسرائيل معنية بتقديم نفسها كدولة ديمقراطية؟ نعم، هي معنية جدا، لأنه إسرائيل تواجه تحدي نزع الشرعية كلما تطرق الحديث عن الاحتلال وممارساته الاستيطانية المستمرة كل يوم. فهي على العكس تركز على خلق مصطلحات بديلة لفكرة احتلال أو استعمار، وتسمي نفسها أحيانا بأنها مجتمع مستوطن مهاجر مثلا كبديل، ومعنية جدا. والسياسيون الإسرائيليون معنيون دائما بضحط هذا أو هذه النظرية. هل يستطيع الخطاب الفلسطيني مواجهة ذلك؟ هذا يعتمد إذا كان الفلسطينيون متمسكون بخطابهم وبروايتهم التاريخية قادرون على الصمود أمام هذا الخطاب الإسرائيلي، قادرون على نقده بشتى الطرق. يعني واحدة من هذه الطرق اللي هم معالجته مع النظريات الديمقراطية المختلفة، ومنها نظرية رولز العدالة، رح أتطرق لهذا السؤال لاحقا. إلى أين تذهب الأمور؟ أيضا هذا يعتمد على الطرفين، مدى تمسك الفلسطينيين بروايتهم، صلابتهم وصمودهم، وهذا ما يعني يؤكده الواقع كل يوم، أن الفلسطينيون متمسكون بروايتهم التاريخية، متمسكون بأرضهم، ولا يتغير الحال. وعلى العكس أظن أن الظروف يعني تخدم الجانب الفلسطيني، لأنه إذا استمرت إسرائيل تقدم نفسها بأنها دولة يهودية وبنفس الوقت ديمقراطية وبهذه الازدواجية وبهذه المفارقة حتى مع الممارسات على الواقع، فيعني أكيد مهما حاولت أن تغطي هذه الأمور لن تغطيها. نتحدث عن السؤال الأهم، وهو عن المنهج، لماذا أو مدى صحة استخدام نظرية جون رولز وتطبيقها على الكيان الاستيطاني في فلسطين. نحن متفقون كفلسطينيون وكعرب بأنه الكيان الاستعماري الاستيطاني، الاحتلال الإسرائيلي هو احتلال مفارق تماما لكل قيم الديمقراطية والعدالة، خارج دائرة البحث إطلاقا. لكن إذا كانت إسرائيل تطرح نفسها على أنها دولة ديمقراطية، وإذا كان المجتمع الدولي يعترف فيها كدولة ديمقراطية، ألا يكون يعني أحد أوجه الصمود ومواجهة الخطاب الإسرائيلي أن نحاول تفنيدها ليس فقط في نظرية رولز، في كل نظرية تعنى بالديمقراطية يجب أن نتناولها ونفندها، نخرجها من دائرة ما تقول. لماذا ممكن السؤال كان يكون لماذا نظرية رولز؟ يعني لماذا نختار نظرية رولز في العدالة دون عن بقية النظريات؟ نظرية رولز من النظريات الحديثة، وربما هي الأحدث في النظريات الليبرالية المتعلقة في الديمقراطية. وإسرائيل حين تقدم خطابها الإسرائيلي لا تقدم نفسها فعليا وفق كل ما تتضمن النظرية. يعني عمليا هي وكأنها تقول أن النظرية تنطبق عليها كدولة ديمقراطية قائمة شكرا، يعطيكم العافية.
حقيقة لا خلاص انتهى الوقت للأسف. طيب تفضل. طيب
أعتذر تماما، أعتذر، لكن أكيد التوثيق راح يكون سليم بالبحث.
شكرا جزيلا. هو حقيقة أنا أعتقد رولز هو نظرته مش عن الديمقراطية إنما عن العدالة اللي هي مختلفة عن الديمقراطية. طيب شكرا جزيلا للأساتذة أسانغا ومايكل وعبد الله ومنى، أحسنتم وشكرا للحضور. والآن بريك.